Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely sweeping text, A Brief History of Russia by Associate Professor Dr. Efisavad Chayapolfat Sirivadanawadachara. We are going to navigate the complete chronological timeline of a nation that is essentially defined by continuous, dramatic transformation. So let's jump right in. Now, keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this today. How do centuries of empires, invasions, and, well, revolutions actually forge a modern superpower? Because history is never just a list of dates, right? It's a profound story of survival. You simply don't get to the modern geopolitical landscape without going through the absolute crucible of the past. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. First up, foundations and Moscow's rise. Second, the Romanovs and imperial expansion. Third, revolution and the Soviet era. And finally, collapse and modern Russia. All right, part 1, foundations and Moscow's rise. So, looking at the macro view, this early era really kicks off with initial cultural development, sowing the seeds of Russian heritage. But that development was violently interrupted by a massive external force, the Mongol invasion. And let me tell you, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a total societal crucible. Out of that intense pressure and its aftermath, Moscow actually emerged as the central organizing power. But progress is rarely a straight line, right? This centralization was eventually followed by severe instability, plunging the region into a really dark, chaotic period historically recognized as the Time of Troubles. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you look at the broader map of the time, the Byzantine Empire offered one major model of civilization, and Western Europe offered another. But early Russia, they didn't simply copy either one. Sure, they absorbed different influences, but ultimately they forged a highly distinct cultural path. They created a totally unique heritage and identity that diverged entirely from both the West and the Byzantine Empire. And honestly, this unique identity becomes the absolute bedrock for everything that follows. Moving right along to part 2, the Romanovs and imperial expansion. A massive defining feature of this era is Westernization. And look, this wasn't some slow, natural evolution. Peter the Great literally looked at the global stage and decided, okay, my empire needs an extreme makeover to compete. He systematically and often forcefully aligned Russian culture, completely restructured the military, and built new infrastructure to meet Western European standards. It was a top-down mandate to modernize an entire empire purely by sheer force of will. And here is the crucial point of what happens next. Peter the Great lays down all this modernized infrastructure, right? Then, Catherine the Great steps in and pushes it to the absolute limit. She takes that brand new, modernized military capability and just dramatically expands the borders outward. I mean, the sheer scale of the empire completely balloons during this time. It totally transforms the nation into an undeniable heavyweight on the world stage. Which brings us to part 3, Revolution and the Soviet era. Let's move to and see how this builds into a breathless, brutal cascade of events. It begins with the immense strain of 19th century conflicts, like the Napoleonic Wars. All of that underlying pressure eventually erupts into the absolute collapse of the old order during the Russian Revolution of 1917. But, as history constantly shows us, revolution doesn't exactly bring immediate peace. Instead, it plunges the nation straight into a devastating civil war. Finally, out of that chaotic vacuum, a rigid new structure emerges, the Soviet system, consolidated firmly and, well, ruthlessly under Stalin's rule. This leads directly into the next massive, defining shock, World War II. Now, this conflict brought incomprehensible devastation and just an unimaginable human toll. Yet, from a purely historical standpoint, it acted as this paradoxical crucible. It fundamentally solidified the Soviet Union's internal machinery, all while radically elevating its external posture into a dominant global military power. Following the Second World War, the entire global dynamic shifted straight into the Cold War. And this wasn't just your typical international friction. We are talking about a prolonged, high-stakes ideological standoff that tested the absolute limits of the newly solidified Soviet machine against the West. This tense balancing act defined superpower status, and it essentially shaped pretty much every single aspect of international relations for decades. And finally, part 4, collapse and modern Russia. The late 20th century brings yet another profound shock, the monumental fall of the Soviet Union. The collapse of that massive apparatus plunges the nation directly into a highly turbulent period of post-Soviet economic and political transition. They literally had to restructure the country from the ground up. Eventually, they pivot from that chaotic transition into the contemporary era, which brings us to modern Russia under the leadership of Putin. Today's modern state is an incredibly complex reality, woven from several distinct threads. You have ongoing economic transitions as the country navigates global markets, sitting right alongside profound political system changes that evolved out of the Soviet collapse. But woven through all of this, and this is so important, is an enduring cultural legacy that has somehow survived centuries of upheaval. Framing the whole picture are the modern geopolitical challenges the nation faces today, which explicitly includes the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. These pillars collectively define the reality we see unfolding right now. So, that leaves us with one vital, final question. How will centuries of expansion, brutal revolution, and incredible resilience actually shape Russia's next chapter? The unique culture, the forced modernizations, the geopolitical standoffs. None of it exists in a vacuum. You can really use this historical framework as your lens to understand tomorrow's headlines. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. And keep learning.